other parts of the world. We have less women artists for the same reasons. It's not easy for women to follow a career, and we do have a more traditional, good Asian society, So let's be honest about that. But yes, it will change as our industries change.
We are trying to create identity of clothing, and it has to be not only the clothing, but it needs to have a business model where the people working are able to make a living. They can make a decent living, that they can send their children to good schools, they can take a holiday, at least have a middle-class aspirational life.
In our report on the creative industries here in Sri Lanka, that was one of the findings, that Sri Lanka could equally position itself as a hub for the film industry in South Asia. But to do so, to incentivize people to come here, the government would need to take some measures, such as introduce tax breaks or such like, to encourage that sort of investment.
The commercial potential of creative and cultural industries. Hello, you're with Echelon's Turning Point, and we are delighted to welcome Orlando Edwards, who is the country director of the British Council in Sri Lanka, Asanka De Mel, who is the founder of Lovi Ceylon, and Saskia Fernando, founder of Saskia Fernando Galleries. I welcome you all. We'll start with you, Orlando. The British Council has been an exponent of culture the world over, particularly, I think, in the Commonwealth. Maybe not exclusively so, though. Can you tell us about your mission and the role that you see the British Council doing in terms of taking a certain country's culture, in this case, Sri Lanka's culture, globally, if at all?
Thank you. Yes, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So that's absolutely right. The British Council are our strapline, if you like, in a sentence. We describe ourselves as the UK's international organisation for cultural and education relations. So cultural's right there in our raison d'etre, our reason for being. And the way that we approach culture is very much about exchange, cultural relations. We know that the UK's culture will thrive, it will only thrive with interaction with international partners. So our role is really to bring UK culture to Sri Lanka, but also to take Sri Lankan culture to the UK. A very nice example, if I may, we supported just recently the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Arts. They took part of their foreigners exhibition to the London Frieze exhibition and had a screening at the Photographers Gallery, which is a very famous gallery in the centre of London. So that's one example, but there are many. I could go on and on. I shan't. But I'm delighted to be here and talk about culture and the creative industries.
Thank you, Orlando. And we have also Asanka De Mel. Asanka is the founder of Lovi Ceylon. You're wearing a Lovi Ceylon outfit, right, Asanka?
Absolutely.
Right. And I was really impressed because, just ahead of this conversation, you were talking about how much of the supply chain around the production of the garment that you're wearing is actually in Sri Lanka. I always assumed you would be sourcing your fabrics from overseas. Can you tell me about why you choose to do so much of your supply chain in Sri Lanka?
Absolutely. I mean, Lovi is essentially building a new identity in clothing. What it is to be Sri Lankan, not looking only at the past, but deeply rooted in our past and our heritage, but looking to the future. What is the new Sri Lankan identity going to look like, right? And how do we represent that in clothing? And that's part of the mission. And given that's our identity, our reason to be, we try to make everything in Sri Lanka, whether it's fabric, as much of the fabric. This is a cotton shirt. We make the cotton here. We do the embroidery. I would say at least 90% of our garments are completely made from fabric onwards here. Sometimes we do import other parts, components, but mostly it's to be made in Sri Lanka brand. So that's the idea. And thank you for having me here, because I wanted to, we have an opportunity to create quite a bit of export revenue through these creative arts. I think, as the report suggested, the creativity is the, oil of the 21st century, right? That's how your report started off. So it is very much true, because we are globally connected. You have access to billions of consumers and partners that you can reach out to. So can we get this going?
Thanks, Asanka. And we are also delighted to have Saskia Fernando. Saskia is the founder of Saskia Fernando Galleries. It's good to have you, Saskia. I mean, you seem to be doing the impossible in a sense, right? You're trying to nurture Sri Lankan art and then take these artists global, right? You could have easily, just been a gallery, an art gallery, and not looked at the ecosystem. Why do you think you want to focus on the ecosystem so much?
I mean, firstly, my reasonings for establishing a gallery in 2009 were very much driven for a passion for the arts. And quite on the contrary, I find that we're not really doing the impossible anymore. 15 years down the line, we're seeing a massive development in the progression of both the contemporary and understanding of the modern Sri Lankan visual art scene. Orlando himself just mentioned there's a museum now which is taking projects overseas. We've been taking Sri Lankan contemporary artists that we work with internationally over the last decade plus. The reason we do this is because it's incredibly important that the international arts community understands what has been happening with the Sri Lankan art scene and our rich and vibrant arts and culture of Sri Lanka. I think it adds so much to the value that our country owns and has the potential to present to the international, not only arts community, but quite frankly to the world.
So I'll ask the three of you to help define the scope of what we call a creative and cultural industry in a country, right? Orlando, you come from if anybody's been to London, it's one thing that strikes you is how rich the cultural life is in London. What's the breadth and depth of what we're talking about here, Orlando? Can you help, for a non-expert audience, define this?
Sure. Well, let's roll back a bit. Let's go back to the 1980s, the 1990s. And it kind of came from this term, the creative industries came out about the same time as what were known as the young British artists, Damien Hirst, Tracey Emin, famous household names in the UK, but they were associated with very clever use of media, social media, drawing attention to their work. They were setting up their studios in poor parts of London, which then contributed to the regeneration of those parts of London. And a great example is what's now London's premium tourist venue, the Tate Modern Gallery, which was an old power station. Yeah, a coal-fired power station. What can we do with it? Turn it into an art gallery? What? And guess what? It now generates billions or millions of pounds in its own right, but also for the neighborhood. And within itself, it's become creative. There are shops, there are restaurants, there are galleries. People can hire it privately as a venue for exclusive evenings to entertain their guests or their friends. So yeah, but just for a very pithy definition, we think in the UK, the creative industries and cultural industries refer to sectors that are involved in the creation, production, and distribution of creative and cultural goods and services.
And do you have a sense about how important this has become, this industry, to the UK economy over the last few decades? Has it grown in significance in the UK economy?
Yeah, absolutely massive. It has grown actually over the past decade at 1.5% times faster than the rest of the economy.
Wow, okay.
And contributed 108 billion pounds sterling gross value added to the UK economy. There are good reasons for this. There have been government policies, investment in education. It doesn't just happen by itself. There are stimuli and approaches and support mechanisms, protection for IP as well, intellectual property. All of these ingredients are really important for the success of a creative economy. But it certainly now has established itself as a really fundamental part of the UK economy, and economists project that the growth will continue. They suggest that 1 million new jobs will be added to the UK's economy purely in the creative sector between now and 2030.
Asanka, let me bring you in. So you talked about how you source 90% of your inputs for the stuff that you made, right? Is that by choice, or is that by some conviction that you have to make this brand really Sri Lankan? And what challenges does that pose to you? Because you are looking to scale the brand, I'm sure.
Actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about creating why we are creating this company, right? So as we are creating, we are trying to create identity of clothing, and it has to be not only the clothing, but it needs to have a business model where the people working are able to make a living. They can make a decent living, that they can send their children to schools, good schools. They can take a holiday. They can, at least have a middle class aspirational life. So when we are looking at that way, then you have to look at like what kind of products you should create. Because if a product doesn't create the economics where the person who's making can't live, there's no point of me creating that product. So for us, as we are engineering these collections, we just launched a new collection. All of this is to look at how do we create better value-added products, not only for the client who's purchasing this, that they can wear for a long period of time, enjoy it, and feel personally vested, but for all the people in the creation of that product, that they can actually have a living. So when you look at that, fabric is essential part of clothing. So if we can invest into that, we can create a higher value added product, a specialized fabric that is only made for Lovi, right? So you create higher value added for clients. The other point I wanted to make is it gives a chance for the clients to appreciate like what we are trying to do. So I'll stop at that one, but it's a conscious choice to create high value added products.
Right. Saskia, I'm just curious about how you set objectives for what you're doing, right? If you look at the business aspect of what you're doing, which is, if you consider what your top objectives are, how would you define them? Is scale important to you? Is taking Sri Lankan artists global and creating great value for the work that they do more important to you than scale? How do you define what you want to be achieving?
It's interesting because that definition changes, I think, almost every 5 years.
Right.
And when we began the gallery, of course, our ultimate goal was to get to the international art fairs. And we've achieved, last year we presented at Frieze London, one of the biggest art fairs in the world. And once you get to that goal, you kind of have to redefine everything because you've gotten there and it's not as exciting anymore. But out of jokes, it's not really about... it's not really about my personal goals. It's about what it does for the industry at the end of the day. Talking about the YBA, for example, I think it was an interesting point because it was really one patron by the name of Charles Saatchi who created the value in that group of artists. So for me, the conversation on patronage right now is very important. The development of the art scene and how we do essentially value that is, what is the appreciation of the market price at the end of the day? So, everything we're trying to do as a gallery for the artists we represent is to see their developmental growth. And at the end of the day, that lands on what is their market value of their art. And we work very closely with some of the leading contemporary artists and emerging artists to see that happen across the board. We don't just hang exhibitions. We invest in residencies. We invest in projects for their own development, taking them to platforms such as the Venice Biennale. This is all to see growth and visibility. And yes, we do have to reach out to the international arts community and see international visibility to really recognize that development. But something that's occurred to me more recently, we need to start owning it more locally. And the real development of our art industry, and I think it relates a lot to this conversation on creative industries, is we need to stop depending on the international community to fund or be responsible for our own development. What can we change within our community? And a lot of that lies in patronage, particularly from corporate and not funding bodies, to develop ourselves. And why do countries like Japan succeed so well in that? It's because they are depending on their own. And this is something which I think is very important to me personally now in the development of the arts, and we're on the verge of launching projects which are very much focused on that and focusing on shifting the audience and visibility to Sri Lanka and letting people come here to see what is happening, as opposed to us always trying to strive for that visibility on international platforms where we always remain, a much smaller presence on a much wider, larger scene.
So following on from that, Orlando, if you look at the success factors around the UK, I'm sure you're more familiar with the UK's cultural scene and its growth than you are of many other countries, maybe. What do you think are the top underlying factors that have resulted in a rate of growth greater than many other industries, and certainly greater than the average rate of growth that you're seeing in the UK? The cultural industries are growing at 1.5% higher than the UK economy.
I mentioned earlier briefly, Saskia's talked about patrons and patronage. Governments, though, also have an important role to play. So a great example in the UK is a large proportion of Hollywood films are now made in the UK. Not many people know this. They think Hollywood films made in Hollywood. But studios just outside of London, I think Radlett, and studios in Northern Ireland, Game of Thrones, for example, shot on site there. But the film industry has invested in the technology and the special effects and all sorts of things that go on behind the scenes. And of course, the centrality of the location as well, very important, close to London, easy access, easy to get to. But the reason the government succeeded there was they applied all sorts of tax breaks, so incentives. So I think the film industry is very cheap to make films in the UK comparatively to other parts of the world. And I think other countries have now caught up. But at the time, it established themselves as a key place to make films. And in fact, in our report on the creative industries here in Sri Lanka, that was one of the findings, that Sri Lanka could equally position itself as a hub for the film industry in South Asia. But to do so, to incentivize people to come here, the government would need to take some measures, such as introduce tax breaks or such like, to encourage that sort of investment to bring people here. So
that's one way of encouraging the industry. What about policy and how the government chooses to spend portions of its budget? Does that matter? What role has that played in the UK, you think?
A good point as well. So supporting initiatives, heritage, cultural heritage, the infrastructure around making art and culture accessible to people. So a lot of investment in museums or making them free public spaces when previously they were paid for. But that kind of created an enabling environment. So a lot of museums, as I say, became more creative in terms of opening up restaurants, or not run by themselves necessarily, but subletting the space and inviting creative culinary acts to come in, gift shops, really looking carefully at what the consumers are interested in, thinking about that consumer experience and becoming quite competitive in that space as well, using their own artifacts or special exhibitions where the curators are involved and advising on what will sell and what people will buy. And that has become a very important part of the income streams for those galleries and public spaces.
Asanka, you mentioned how you don't want the industry that you're part of to be one that sort of traps people in poverty, in a life that leaves them with few choices, right? And when you look at how you want to scale this, right, beyond, I mean, that's a fantastic ideal on which to fund, base some of your foundational thinking. And when you look at what it will take for you to grow your business, or for the industry to flourish, you are in the fabrics and fashion industry.
Yeah.
What do you think the government or policy can do to help?
I think I wanted to address to Orlando's point. Even though we can talk about tax breaks and policy breaks, the government is already in a difficult position right now in terms of their financial planning and all of that. So just asking for more tax breaks or more spending from the government is probably to me, at least for the next 5-year period, is a little bit moot, because even if you get it, you'll get like $500,000, which essentially is nothing. So I think the opportunity for us is that we have 20 million people here, 3 million people outside of the country. We are quite creative, quite resilient people. If we can energize and the awareness that we have, if we can mobilize the people we have here, who has enough sufficient disposable income, people who are traveling to here from Sri Lankan's diaspora coming here, as well as the visitors coming here. Those kind of policy, if you look at, cutting maybe some of the red tape and making it easier for that to function, I think that's a much better approach than trying to ask for the government to spend XYZ or give tax breaks. I don't think it's needed. In fact, I would say all the subsidies given over a large period has essentially lulled the private sector into some kind of, sleepiness. Their growth rate is below inflation. It is a hard thing to say, but where is the growth from the private sector? It's easy to point to the government all the time. They are doing something wrong. Show me the growth rate in dollar terms larger than inflation if you take the entire company is on public companies. What is their plan for employees who's been working from 1980? If you take let me give you a specific example. Show me the data on a machine operator who at a company from 1980 to 2023 in dollar terms adjusted for inflation. Show me that it has grown. And if it hasn't, show me a plan that in the next 15 years, that if you continue, it can grow. So if that kind of plan is, I think, more valid, and it is definitely only private sector led, than asking for somebody who doesn't
Does your past in the consulting industry help frame how you look at this issue, you think?
No, I think no, it's not that. It's just like, there's no point of hitting your head in a rock and asking for something, right? We know the government is in a very difficult situation. And if you look at the budget, you can see the allocations. They are trying, but it's not meaningful in terms of real change, right? Because if you put $500,000 to create a university, that is not going to work, right? It's going to waste a lot of people's time and energy. So I think I just being realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Saskia, it struck me that, you had almost come full circle. You've taken Sri Lankan artists global, exhibited at important fairs elsewhere. And now you come back to the realization that, Sri Lankan patronage is so crucial for art to thrive and survive and thrive, right? It also begs the question that Sri Lanka is a relatively poor country. The number of patrons you can maybe count on are far fewer, right? Does the commercially flourishing of creative and cultural industries always have they got to be so closely linked to the economy, or can we look for inspiration and examples even elsewhere where there can be a divergence? How are you thinking about this?
I mean, right now I'm thinking that we haven't seen these partnerships locally, and we see it very much coming from, one or two companies or more from a CSR directive. And yes, I mean, looking at what Asanka is saying, I agree wholeheartedly with that. But there is potential from these partnerships, and these do trickle down to, less affluent practitioners. We have been able to see over the last 2 decades that artists are now able to make a very lucrative career out of the arts. These things have changed. So, there are multiple benefits from these partnerships with corporate. I think right now we need to focus on the development of that, because if we keep going, and I think this is a more sort of global South conversation as well, if we keep going with the begging bowl to funding bodies and depending on that coming from outside of the country, I think we're doing something very wrong. So I would sort of answer that with other options if we had already developed that. But quite frankly, I don't think we have. And speaking to a lot of companies, there's often this lack of understanding on how it can be beneficial to work with the creative industries and support the creative industries, and how those can be partnerships. Of course, we are looking at a country that is still coming out of an economic crisis. So yes, it is not on the priority of everybody's list. But as far as I'm concerned, I think that there is a lot of opportunity which can lie. I mean, we spoke about Sri Lanka becoming a hub. I mean, Sri Lanka has the potential to become a hub for the arts as well. If you look at Sri Lanka and the South Asian region, we are one of the few countries that is accessible to the rest of the region. This holds huge opportunities for our country. And I think everyone, is in agreement. Even our neighbors in the other parts of South Asia agree that Sri Lanka is such a wonderful place to visit. So I think we lend ourselves very well to massive opportunities. Another thing about the arts is oftentimes coming back to patronage. The big art patrons internationally and in South Asia are also connected with very large businesses. So you can already see that these things often go hand in hand. So the opportunities, as far as I'm concerned, are quite endless as far as focusing on these partnerships.
Orlando, how do you view this? You've, with the British Council, you worked in several places in China and other places in Asia also, I think. Is it important for a country to be also economically well off before it can see its creative industries thrive, or is there a shorter route to making that happen?
I don't think there are any shortcuts, but it's not necessary for a country to be economically developed. There are various ingredients that are common and are non-exclusive. So, for example, investment in education system or talent development. All countries have budgets for their education, but do they consider how that is structured or focused? Are they nurturing the talent? Are they identifying where the talent could be supported more or better? And is the curriculum created in such a way to stimulate that? So in fact, thinking back to the young British artists, they had an impact on how art courses were taught. So there was a shift in terms of from quite traditional ways, and that's true of the arts through the centuries. Is that they're but one example of many. Of course, great artists have always influenced the way things are taught and how that changes. But they had a very definite impact on creativity and creativity courses as they were taught at higher education institutions. And I think that there's an opportunity here in Sri Lanka for perhaps better connectivity or joined up across. So Saskia's talked about patrons, but academia and businesses, the way that they work together and operate or create opportunities for each other. There's a sort of mutual interdependency that can stimulate and help flourish the economy, the creative economy.
I'd like to ask the two of you, shall we start with you, Saskia? And Sri Lanka does spend a portion of its budget, I suppose, on arts education, particularly at tertiary level. There are universities that focus on fine arts and creativity in general. Do you still see a gap in what their role is versus the objective of expanding the creative and cultural industries? How do you feel they play? How do you assess
the role of the universities?
universities?
I think the role of the universities what I've observed in the visual arts, I recently attended the graduate show of the University of Visual and Performing Arts. And it was the first time I had seen such a large exhibition, such a large graduate show. So they're obviously focusing a lot on, what is happening in the university and the syllabus, etc. But that is a very small portion in what makes a healthy art industry. There are a lot of players who need to be involved. And I think, answering that question, it needs to be looked at more in terms of the ecosystem. So how does the university play a role? How do the patrons, do the corporate patrons, do the museums and institutions, the government, the representatives of art work together? I think we lack the right approach to working together in Sri Lanka. I think it might be common in smaller industries and smaller scenes. I think there needs to be more connectivity between these organizations, as Orlando mentioned. And I think the strength lies in that. Currently, we have a very interesting, something I've observed over the last few years is that we have a very divided approach to non-profit and commercial. When in fact, if we're just talking about the visual arts industry, they're very interconnected. But the organizations working on non-profit want to stay far away from the commercial world. But in fact, they need to work hand in hand because it's the commercial that is driving the market. The nonprofit oftentimes is looking at, as we mentioned, this more sort of CSR approach, which is not really building the scene. So we want to develop the industry, but then we want everything to focus in more of a CSR objective. So we need to kind of align our objectives in a much stronger way. And a lot of that needs to happen with the ecosystem and ecosystem development, and maybe learning from other countries such as India, Bangladesh, more relative countries who we can, see parallels with, and taking them as examples on how to strengthen our industries.
Asanka, the same question to you. Sri Lanka has a rich history of fabric making. How well has that transitioned to the 21st century and the sorts of products that you want to do?
Well, great question. I wanted to actually step back even to my previous comment. We have somehow through, if you look at a little bit last 50 years of Sri Lanka, through wars, through many rounds of wars, we have somehow managed to get to this place. So even having this infrastructure we have today, with not only the physical infrastructure, but the educational and the intellectual infrastructure we have, so we are in a good place. Our corporate structures are pretty good. We have big companies doing, hard work. So we have a good place to start. So I think the question is, how can we get from here and help to kind of bootstrap to again another tier up, right? So when my comments about even like production of clothing, we have built the, not only the factories and all of that, but a very good middle management, upper management on how to do that kind of large scale production. And it not only that helps that, but it had created this, infrastructure on many other areas of production even, right? So now we have that. Now, can we mobilize that to get to the next level? Coming to Saskia's thing, and I have to thank you for bringing this. One of the things is the awareness of the creative industry. We are not even thinking about it, or we are not talking about it enough. Right. How many people have gone to the museum in the last 5 years? The price for a Sri Lankan to enter the museum is 100 rupees. So it's not a price barrier for majority of the people to enter or go and visit any of the locations. But it is not part of our activity level, right? There's no common practice that you go into the museum every 3 months. The museums are also not inviting with new setups or new, shows to get you. So those kind of activities, they're not really huge budget concerning things. It's essentially a way to bootstrap in order to create a culture. You can be very specific with it. We need only 3 traveling exhibitions that can be hosted, 4 every quarter. You have now a new one for people to come visit. So building that culture, for example.
I think also building we have the product.
Yes, we have the product.
We're just not promoting it properly.
Right.
I mean, look at Polonnaru and Anuradhapura. I mean, how much do we promote? These 2 locations on their own should be on the billboards internationally to promote Sri Lanka. But we put beaches. I mean, our beaches are as beautiful, but how many competitors do we have in that area? I mean, why are we not promoting our product in a stronger way? And I think there has to be more done in regards to that. We have a beautiful museum. We have an empty National Art Gallery. We have a vibrant art scene that, has been in existence throughout the war.
Yeah.
And it actually grew as a scene during COVID. So we're just not promoting it properly as a country.
Orlando, if you look at the success of Asian countries, let's look at the region, where we can maybe relate to it more, right? Look at Singapore, South Korea, even Japan. Look at South Korea's sort of potential with K-pop, for instance, or Japan with its anime. These have gone global, right? I don't know how much of those circumstances you understand, but what do you think those in Asia are getting right that Sri Lanka can learn from?
Yeah, good question, and you're right. I don't have a deep understanding. So, but obviously haven't failed to notice how K-pop has taken the world by storm, nor that Korean movies have recently won Oscars in the last few years. You know, where has that come from? It's come from nowhere. But the government has decided they want to be recognized in that creative sector, and that's what they want to project out into the world. It comes back to what Saskia was saying, you know, where do you want to be? How do you want people to perceive you as a nation? Or what are your jewels? What is the culture that you want to share? So with the Korean films, it wasn't that they made some Hollywood style films. They were very proudly promoting Korean culture. And of course, Korea has become a destination. Film, music, literature, fashion, visual arts, they are all pull factors that will pull in tourists who will spend money, enjoy the time, and then they become your champions or your messengers, word of mouth, and your advertising becomes free in a sense. Or you can spend it on different things and prop up other parts of the economy.
What do the two of you think will make it possible for Sri Lanka to hit big? I mean, recently, Yohani's song, Manike, was a sensation in South Asia, right? I mean, it was one of the rare moments when, millions, if not a billion people appreciated something out of Sri Lanka. Do we look for triggers? Do we look for incremental? How should we look at then building on this strategy that, you so eloquently talked about that, we have it. It's a matter of taking it out there. How should we look at it?
Just K-pop is, I think, about $500 million in by itself in export revenue. The three movies, Barbie, Avatar, and Top Gun, grossed $4 billion in revenue and about $2.5 billion in export revenues. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't include even the merchandising, right? If you look at our strengths, we are globally connected digitally. Mm-hmm. So that is a strength that comes cheap. Mm-hmm. We don't have to build that infrastructure, right? And digital products can transform, like the Yohani's song. I think just encouraging that more of that talent development, right? But it's not only the talent development. I can speak on Yohani. She's actually a brand ambassador for Lovi. The work ethic and the team behind it working, right? She's intelligently build a team behind it. Sure. That can support that infrastructure is there, and for many artists that is not, right? So like there's an entire team in India, team here, team in Dubai that manages her and makes sure those opportunities are coming to her and to leverage. You don't get on the podium with the top Bollywood actors to sing if you are not vetted on so that is, but those are things we can do. Another very specific example is we have an amazing 180 missions out there, Sri Lankan missions everywhere, and all of them have a cultural program. So one of the things the private sector can also do is Saskia and I am guilty of this, is we haven't really interfaced with the foreign ministry to educate how our products or services or culture can be, in a way that they can understand and promote in their communities. So this is a very specific thing. It doesn't cost much. It's a Zoom connection that we are planning to do, and I encourage anybody else who wants to join to essentially educate through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs the various missions on the culture that is growing, because sometimes they're actually kind of distracted or detached from what's happening, because there's a lot of happening over here. I mean, she's done a great job creating all these beautiful artists, but how many of the missions kind of know even the scene over here? So we can engage them, those communities, and even the diaspora that is available through that. I think, at least for a first place, trying to tap into the diaspora groups, I think is probably a very useful thing. To get the seed money, we need to bootstrap ourselves to the next larger level.
Yes. Saskia, you on the same point, you deal with these artists. How aware are they, or how connected are they to the opportunity out there? Do they, are they doing the things that they need to be doing in terms of becoming, plugging themselves closely to the ecosystem for them to scale, to become big?
I mean, the artists that I work with, some of them are completely removed from the ecosystem. So it's my job to keep them, plugged in and engaged. But I'm coming back to what Asanka was saying about professionalism. I think this is something really, really important that needs to be developed. I have to say that running a commercial gallery for 15 years has been challenging in our environment. It's been really tough. Oftentimes, it's frowned upon to run a commercial establishment engaged with the arts because we're looking at the art scene as a charity. And therefore, working and developing a professional structure around the art industry rather than looking at the development that I know we have played a very strong role in the last 15 years, we're often criticized as an establishment for taking from and not acknowledged for what we have given to. And what I'm most proud of is our professionalism. And I know from working with leading institutions, representatives, galleries from around the world, we've built that credibility. And you spoke about Yohani and the team behind her. Yes, this song was, that was sort of overnight success. I don't believe in overnight success. I believe in slow, long-term benefits. And that's how I work with the artists that I'm working with. But I think we need to work harder on professionalism, and we need to stop seeing the creative industry as a side dish. I think we need to acknowledge what we have in our creative industries. And I think we also need to understand and acknowledge that we need to, across the board, develop our systems and our professionalism. And we're not really, ahead of the game as far as that is concerned. And that's where everything is misaligned. I think we can look at that across the board in terms of what we have going on in the country.
Orlando, a couple of years ago, the British Council had commissioned a report on Sri Lanka's creative and cultural industries. I noticed you had a copy there. Maybe you can show that to us. That is it? Yeah, that is the one. That was published in 2020, right? Can you tell us the strategy, the thinking behind trying to understand what the creative industries were like in Sri Lanka, and what was the objective of the report?
Yes, it's a great report, and sadly it came out during COVID. And so it was an online launch, and it didn't quite get the profile it deserved, I feel. So it's wonderful, just to reiterate Asanka's words, to be here, to be talking about this, because it is an important unsung hero of economies around the world. But that's the thing, that people don't really know about it. And as with any discipline, and just as Saskia was saying, there's always a lot of hard work and grind behind success. Overnight, it doesn't really happen like that, unless you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth. But even then, it's not guaranteed. You have to work hard to get places. And part of understanding your jewels is about mapping them out. So right at the outset, this is something that the British Council has been involved in around the world, where we've supported governments and policymakers with their creative economy strategies. And I know a bit about this because my first job in London with the British Council was with the then Creative Economy Unit. And we launched some prizes talking about stimuli, the Young Creative Entrepreneur of the Year Award, the Young Publisher of the Year Award, the Young Visual Artist or Curator of the Year Award, all sorts of awards just to raise the profile, raise that awareness. But what the report does, it investigates, it interrogates what is the creative sector? What are the strengths in Sri Lanka? The visual arts, fashion, architecture. Where is their potential? Film, jewelry, design. Where do they overlap? Where do they interact? Where are their blockages? What can be done to unblock, to help these sectors to thrive and to prosper where they're not doing so or as much as they could be? So that's really what the report attempted to do. It also attempted to put a value on the creative economy, which is a very controversial and difficult thing to do. But at the time, the report's findings suggested that the creative economy here in Sri Lanka was worth or employed more people than the tourism sector.
Wow.
Quite a finding. And I think probably quite difficult to verify, and perhaps things have changed even in the last few years. But you can't ignore the fact that plays a huge role for the economy. It's really an important sector that needs to be recognized in its own right. And at the time, I just wanted to add one final thing. In terms of the value of the creative economy, John Newbegin, Sir John, I think he's now, or OBE, he's a great advisor to the British Council and advisor to governments around the world, recorded an interesting session around the launch, and it's there on YouTube for those who are interested. But he made the point that around 2020, governments around the world were investing as much money in the creative sector, those governments that were looking to change and get ahead and think for job creation for their workforces, as the oil and gas sector, which is quite an astonishing factoid. I think $600 billion a year or something at the time, 2020, governments, and they were investing in gaming, video gaming, film, content, what he calls storytelling. Really, we're all interested in stories. We're interested in each other's stories, but that's the sort of content that goes into songs, it goes into films, it goes into painting, or the stories of fabric and design for fashion gurus as well. And we've been telling stories as a species ever since, right? Of course, we need energy to cook and to light and to record our programs that we make. But just a really interesting fact there that the creative economy was measured at that time by researchers to be as heavily invested in by forward-looking governments as the energy sector.
Is what's holding us back also somewhat cultural? Or do we frown upon somebody who makes a choice about becoming part in the creative economy versus, becoming a consultant or a banker or a medical professional? Do you feel we are like that as a society?
I feel actually, thanks, that's a great question. And to point out, to build on Orlando's conversation, the economy is changing, right? You've gone through industrialization. Now we are in a creative economy. So parents understand that their children are not all going to be doctors or engineers or lawyers. There's so many opportunities right now in the creative industries. There are many universities over here. Parents are very wise to invest into what is the future that is coming. Children are even wiser because it's their futures. So they are already investing into what is coming. As the new economies. I am very optimistic, even though I think we're at a good place. We are starting. We have some issues to work out, but mostly it is awareness. And we are talking about this from an optimistic point of view and how to help. And the biggest challenge I see is how do we get this bootstrapped? How do we get this one step in front of the other and start moving? And you're absolutely right. The craft sector, for example, in your report correctly pointed out, it's the largest employment sector because it can employ a lot of women. And it's the largest group that on the creative sector, the women are employed. Because they can do it from their homes, they can do it while they are, sometimes in the evenings or afternoons, or helping with the families, as well as you might be a banker during the day and in the evening you're working on your art. So there's a lot of areas that people are working like that in creating the value addition. And for us as an economy to recognize that value and to, I think, shows like this and many more shows to highlight the value of an artist. We appreciate a doctor not only because that person can do something, but because also we appreciate culturally through programs like this, valuing what they're doing. Similarly, an architect, same idea. So if we start valuing the artists and the creative people who are doing this, not only the award shows are nice, but even going a little bit more deeper. Recognition from the award shows are a start, but can we go deeper so that, to really understand that they are really providing value to the rest of us in our own humanity, right? So if you look at from that point of view, I think we have a chance to create a very large, the coming economy is not industrial. Coming economy is creative. So which economy you want to train for?
Saskia, do you think perceptions here have been rather sticky about those employed, the negative view that we may have had about those employed or seeking opportunity in the creative industry? Are those perceptions changing, do you think?
They change when things change. So I've seen that with young artists that we're engaging with via production fund that we set up 2 years ago. And oftentimes the artists visit the exhibitions with their sort of opening exhibitions with their parents. And their parents are thrilled and they come and thank me and say, thank you so much. Because my parents didn't really know what I was trying to do with my life when I went to design school or when I went to art school. And now they've realized that this is something they can take seriously. So much like anywhere else in the world, these perceptions are changing. We have a lot of the same issues as other parts of the world. We have less women artists for the same reasons. It's not easy for women to follow a career, and we do have a more traditional, good Asian society, so let's be honest about that. But yes, it will change as our industries change. And that's what I feel a huge responsibility to do that from within, to be involved in that, to see where are the areas where we can personally develop. Yes, we can sit and complain, the government policy and all these things need to change. But to be honest, what can we do individually or as organizations working together within these structures that we've been, to be honest, plowing ahead since the times of civil wars. And for me, having the advantage of having grown up in a family of creative people, it was never a shift. So I take that as an advantage that I can learn from and oftentimes pass on to others and say, well, if you're professional and you work hard enough, you can make it. So yes, I do hope that that things are going to change, and I do see shifts. But there's of course a lot more work that we need to do.
I want to add one point. Creative industry in every country is difficult. Being a creative in any country, any artist, every artist is struggling. I've lived in the US, I have many friends who are artists or dancers. So they're all struggling. It's not that they are all billionaires flying around. So it's a choice. It is, the infrastructure can be made, but to be honest, it's a lot of work, and you're living with your passion, and it's not only here. I don't want to say that every other country's artists are all, no, every other country is investing so that it can develop.
But does it have to be like a feast or famine kind of like scenario, is it like that elsewhere also, Orlando?
Yes.
I'm afraid, yes, it probably is. I mean, that is perhaps... we talk about the young British artists. For all the success stories there were probably 1 million failures or 1,000 failures, and you have to be prepared to fail, but you have to have a support mechanism, I guess, for those failures.
I mean, that's my point, that it's not that in Sri Lanka only, so many artists. I went to school in Austin, Texas. There are so many musicians who wants to be the next Taylor Swift or whoever, but they find their own space and they'll find it. So it continues.
All right, this has been a wonderful conversation. Can I ask each of you to maybe take a minute or two to put any final thoughts on the table? Can I start with you, Saskia?
Oh, goodness. So many thoughts. I mean, firstly, thank you to Echelon for always being a great supporter of the work that we do, and I think the creative industries as well. I'm always very sort of critical about when art gets landed on the lifestyle pages. So it's really nice to have our leading business magazine supporting the arts. I think it's such an incredibly important part, and it's wonderful to be having this conversation. I think the fact that we're sitting at this table today is already a huge sign of the fact that we're moving forward. I think the wonderful report that British Council has prepared, the conversations that it's encouraging, the work of brands like Asanka's and Colombo Fashion Week, all the programs that are happening in the arts. I think we've come a really long way in the last 10 years. So I'm sure there's so much more that's going to be worth talking about and discussing and arguing about even. But I think there's a lot that's going to happen in the creative industries in Sri Lanka. And yes, as you're correctly pointing out, this is a turning point. So hopefully we'll speak again soon and have more to bring to the table on developments.
Final thoughts, Asanka?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting this conversation. I think we are definitely at a turning point. We are actually not even a turning point. We have a lot in here. We just have to keep moving. I ask all your listeners and participants to take their kids and take themselves to the museums. To take them to the planetarium. We have all these beautiful places. Right. Go visit them, because your participation is what is most needed. Go take them to Saskia's gallery. Right. It's free to enter, actually. I go there. Your participation is what drives. So go participate, and that gives so much confidence.
Thank you. And Orlando, last words.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation, and wonderful to share a platform with Asanka and Saskia, two creative pioneers. I mean, just to hit home the point that these days ideas are worth more than products. If you look at the iPhone, for example, I think 6% of the cost of an iPhone goes to the people who make it in Foxconn factories. 60% stays with the designers. And that's a kind of metaphor, really, is that the creative economy is not so much about production now, but it's more about ideas and being agile and being flexible, not necessarily upskilling always, sometimes reskilling, but always being agile and flexible and being prepared to move and change if necessary.
Orlando Edwards, Asanka De Silva, Saskia Fernando, this has been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate so much your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.